The first time 100 strangers treated my front yard like a public park, I almost convinced myself it was charming. Small town life, right? Friendly people, Sunday bells, neighbors walking by. Then one morning I watched a woman toss an empty coffee cup straight into my wife's flower bed without even glancing down, and that was the moment something inside me quietly shifted. Not anger exactly, more like a door closing somewhere deep in your chest. My name's Daniel Harper, and if you've ever had to defend something you built with your own two hands, well, you might understand why this story didn't end politely. My wife Elise and I left Chicago back in 2009. We were pushing 40, exhausted from sirens at 2 in the morning, traffic that never stopped, neighbors you shared walls with but never knew. You know what I mean, the kind of life where everything feels crowded, loud, and strangely lonely all at once. So when we found Maple Hollow, Pennsylvania, it felt like stepping into another century. 2 stoplights, 1 hardware store, a diner that served meatloaf every Wednesday like clockwork, and a white church with a tall steeple that rang its bell every Sunday at 9 sharp. Postcard perfect. The house sealed the deal. A Victorian built in 1889, tall narrow windows, gingerbread trim that needed work, a wraparound porch that creaked in the wind like it was telling stories from another era. It sat on just over 2 acres, which to us felt like owning a national park. I still remember Elise standing out in the yard during the showing, spinning slowly with her arms stretched wide, laughing like a kid. "We can plant peonies here," she said, pointing toward the eastern edge. "Hydrangeas along the fence, maybe a little orchard over there." We bought the house within a month. And for the first 6 years life was exactly what we'd hoped. Next door was First Covenant Chapel. Small place. 50 people on a busy Sunday. Quiet services, polite folks walking by on the sidewalk. Sometimes they'd wave at us from the street. Sometimes they'd stop and chat. We donated to their Christmas toy drive once. Elise baked pies for their summer fundraiser. It all felt neighborly. Simple. Then in 2016 they hired a new pastor. Pastor Nolan Briggs. Early 40s. Sharp jawline. Always wearing perfectly pressed shirts like he'd stepped out of a magazine. He came from one of those massive suburban churches outside Columbus, the kind with parking attendants and coffee bars in the lobby. From the very first Sunday he stepped behind that pulpit, you could feel the energy change. People called him dynamic, visionary, a builder of community. What that meant in real life was simple. More services, more events, more people. Within a year the congregation doubled, then tripled. Sunday mornings turned into a slow parade of SUVs and minivans circling Maple Hollow looking for somewhere, anywhere to park. The church lot only held about 40 cars. After that filled up, people started lining Maple Street. Then Oak. Then eventually the narrow gravel shoulder that bordered our property. At first it was harmless. Just a couple people stepping off the gravel and cutting across our yard to save a few steps. I noticed it one Sunday while trimming the hedges. A guy in loafers stepped off the shoulder, gave me a little nod, and walked diagonally across our grass toward the church side entrance. I remember thinking, that's new. The next week there were 3 people. The week after that maybe 10. By late spring there was a visible path worn into the yard, a thin brown line where grass used to grow. Elise tried to laugh it off. "Maybe we should charge admission," she joked one morning. But I could see the tension around her eyes. Because Elise loved that garden like it was alive. She knew every bulb, every root, every fragile stem she'd planted over the years. And things escalated fast. People didn't just walk through anymore. They hurried. They dragged strollers. Kids ran straight across the beds. One Sunday someone dropped a powdered donut and ground it into the soil with their heel. Another afternoon I found a plastic communion cup stuck between Elise's hostas. That was when I decided to talk to Pastor Briggs. I caught him after the second service, standing by the church doors shaking hands like a politician on election day. "Pastor," I said, offering my hand. "Daniel Harper, your neighbor." He smiled wide. "Daniel, yes. Beautiful property you've got there." "Thank you," I said. "Actually, that's what I wanted to mention." I explained the shortcut. The damage. Asked if he could remind people to stick to the sidewalk. He nodded immediately. "Oh my goodness, absolutely. I'll make an announcement next Sunday. We want to be good neighbors." I walked home relieved. Problem solved. Except the next Sunday it got worse. More people than ever. It was like my request had advertised the shortcut. I stood at the kitchen window watching wave after wave of strangers cross the yard. A woman in heels stumbled on one of Elise's stepping stones and knocked it sideways. Two teenage boys cut straight through the flower bed instead of around it. And that was when the coffee cup happened. That pastel cardigan woman. Tossing it into the garden like the ground didn't matter. I called Pastor Briggs that afternoon. "Hey Nolan," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's actually gotten worse." There was a pause on the phone, just long enough to feel deliberate. "Well, Daniel," he said finally, voice softer now. "You know how it is. When people see others walking a certain way, they follow. It's private property." "I understand," he replied gently. "But we're trying to grow something meaningful here. Community sometimes requires flexibility." Flexibility. That word sat in my chest like a rock. Over the next few weeks, the damage multiplied. We put up little signs. "Private property, please use sidewalk." People ignored them. One sign got knocked over. Another disappeared entirely. What bothered me most wasn't the grass. Grass grows back. What bothered me was the assumption. The quiet entitlement. Like our yard had become part of their parking lot. One night Elise looked at me across the kitchen table and said something that stuck with me. "If we don't draw a line now, there won't be a line left to draw." So I called a lawyer. Margaret Ellis. Silver hair cut sharp at the jaw. The kind of woman who didn't waste words. After listening to everything, she folded her hands and said simply, "That's trespassing. Can they claim public access?" I asked. "Not without an easement. And trust me, we'd know." She sent the church a formal cease and desist letter. 2 weeks later their response arrived. They claimed the path across our yard was a historic pedestrian route used by the community for decades. I actually laughed when I read it, because for 6 quiet years before Pastor Briggs arrived, not a single person had walked that path. Margaret didn't laugh. "They're testing you," she said. And that was the moment the misunderstanding turned into a fight. Court was scheduled for February. Winter came and buried the path under snow. For a couple months the yard rested. Then spring returned, and the dirt line appeared again, darker and deeper than before. One Sunday I stepped outside and asked a group politely to use the sidewalk. A woman stopped and asked loudly, "Oh, are you the one suing the church? I'm asking you not to trespass." She pursed her lips. "We're just trying to get to service. There's a sidewalk. It adds 5 minutes." Behind her, a teenager rolled his eyes and walked straight across the grass anyway. That was the moment I stopped expecting people to choose decency on their own. February finally arrived. Small courtroom, fluorescent lights, old wooden benches. Pastor Briggs sat across the aisle in a navy suit, looking calm, almost serene. Margaret presented photos, surveys, property deeds. The church lawyer talked about community benefit and shared space. Finally, the judge looked over his glasses and said something simple. "Show me the easement." The lawyer paused. "There is no recorded easement, Your Honor." "That's sufficient." Just like that, the ruling came down. The church had no legal right to cross our property. They were ordered to stop immediately and post signs directing people to the sidewalk within 14 days. 14 days. I thought that would end it. It didn't. 2 weeks passed. No signs appeared. The following Sunday, people walked across our yard like the judge's order didn't exist. I stood at the kitchen window holding the court document in my hand. Elise looked at me. Didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The polite phase was over. The next morning I called a landscaping company. By Saturday, a truckload of emerald green arborvitae trees arrived. 6-foot privacy hedge. Dense. Beautiful. And planted exactly where that dirt shortcut had carved through our yard. By Sunday morning the hedge stood like it had always belonged there. When the first family walked up from their parked SUV, they stopped dead. The father blinked at the wall of green. Behind him another couple slowed. A teenage girl said out loud, "Wait, what?" People walked along the hedge, searching for an opening. There wasn't one. Eventually they turned toward the sidewalk. 5 extra minutes. That's all it had ever been. 2 weeks later the church tried to sue again. They claimed the hedge was malicious. A spite fence. Judge Whitaker looked at the photos, leaned back, and said calmly, "Property owners have the right to landscape their property." Motion denied. He even ordered the church to reimburse our legal fees and pay for the damage done to Elisa's garden. About $4,500. Not life-changing money. But it felt like acknowledgement. 3 years have passed now. The arborvitae have grown thick and tall. Birds nest in them. In autumn they glow gold in the sunset. On Sundays I still hear the church bells. Families still walk by. On the sidewalk. Exactly where they could have walked all along. And sometimes I wonder, did it really have to go that far? Maybe if I'd drawn the line sooner things would have been simpler. Maybe if I'd been firmer from the start we could have avoided the whole war. But here's what I learned. Community doesn't mean surrendering your boundaries. Grace doesn't mean becoming a doormat. And growth, real growth, respects the space it expands into. So now I'm curious what you think. Were we wrong? Was the hedge too much? Should we have let it go for the sake of harmony? Or is protecting your home exactly what you're supposed to do when people keep stepping over the line? I'd honestly like to hear where you land. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me what you would have done if 100 strangers treated your yard like their shortcut. And if you believe boundaries matter, or if you think sometimes peace is worth the sacrifice, share this story with someone who might see it differently. Because in the end, this wasn't really about a path through grass. It was about the moment you decide where the line is, and what you're willing to do when someone refuses to stop crossing it.